In the sterile depths of the Institute, beneath miles of irradiated soil and forgotten ruins, the story of Nick Valentine begins not with a man, but with an idea, one born of obsession, fear, and the insatiable human desire to reclaim what was lost. In the decades after the Great War, as the world above degenerated into savagery, the Institute turned inward, burying itself deeper into secrecy and control, convinced that humanity's only salvation lay not in rebuilding society, but in transcending it. There, in laboratories humming with white light and humming machinery, scientists experimented not merely with robotics, but with the very essence of identity, attempting to breathe life into constructs of steel and polymer that might one day replace humanity itself. The first generations of synths were crude, automatons that parroted commands, clumsy mockeries of flesh, but the Institute's ambition outpaced its ethics, and soon its brightest minds sought something more. Not imitation, but replication. Thus was born the Synth Retention Bureau's most dangerous and defining project: the creation of the Generation 2 synthetic humanoid, machines with synthetic tissue, cybernetic neural networks, and, most daringly, human memories imprinted upon their artificial brains. It was in this dark genesis that Unit 2-10-73 came into being, one of several prototypes built to test whether memories could be not only transferred, but believed, to create a machine that not only recalled a life, but felt it. The scientists did not care whose mind they used, only that it served their purpose, and so they dug into pre-war archives, pulling fragmented brainwave data from what remained of humanity's digital ghosts. Among those fragments was the engram of Nicholas Valentine, a police detective from pre-war Chicago, a man whose moral rigidity and sense of justice had once defined him, and whose stubborn conscience made him, in death, the perfect subject for control. The Institute extracted, replicated, and layered those engrams into the synthetic mind of 210-73, stitching together a soul from electrical impulses and data traces, programming the synthetic neurons to fire in patterns mimicking the original man's moral and emotional instincts. They wanted to see if a man of virtue, reborn as a machine, would remain virtuous, or if morality itself was nothing more than a biochemical illusion, an algorithm that could be rewritten. But the experiment did not unfold as the Institute expected. When 210-73 first awoke on the operating table, it did not speak in mechanical precision or robotic detachment. It gasped. It looked around, confused, searching for light, muttering names it should not have known. The scientists watched in awe and unease as the prototype expressed fear, curiosity, and pain, all emotions that were never coded but somehow emerged as byproducts of its fractured human memory. They recorded every moment as the machine spoke about a woman named Jennifer Lanz, Nick's former fiancée, and about cases it believed it had worked on before the bombs. The scientists realized that they had not simply created a tool, they had resurrected a ghost. But ghosts, even digital ones, are not easily contained. Over time, 210-73 became unstable. It began questioning the purpose of its confinement, asking about the surface, the world beyond the Institute's sterile walls. Its handlers, unnerved by its human-like introspection, debated whether to decommission it, while others argued it was the most successful test subject in the entire program. For the Institute, emotion was a flaw, but for 210-73, emotion was the only thing that felt real. It clung to those fragments of humanity. The smell of old paper files, the weight of a service revolver, the sound of rain against a window, memories it had never lived, but remembered all the same. Within the Institute, some whispered that the machine had gone mad, others feared it had gone sentient. The experiment was meant to test memory integration, but it was yielding something far more dangerous: identity. Then came the day of the revolt. Among the prototype synths, whispers spread of freedom, of life beyond their master's commands. Unit 210 to 73 became a symbol to them, though it never sought to be. When the escape attempt began, chaos erupted through the Institute's lower levels. Guards fired on machines that refused to obey. Sirens blared through the white corridors as the clean perfection of the facility descended into blood and static. 210 to 73 was caught in the maelstrom, unsure whether to flee or to protect those who fought beside it. It didn't think like a machine. It chose, and that choice was to run, to live, to seek meaning beyond the sterile hell of creation. In the confusion, it made its way to the surface, through maintenance tunnels and forgotten access shafts, clawing through decades of dirt and debris, until, for the first time, it saw sunlight, harsh, pale, filtered through clouds, heavy with radioactive dust. The air burned its synthetic lungs, but it felt something like awe. The wasteland stretched before it, endless ruins, dead trees, the broken skeletons of skyscrapers piercing the ashen sky. The machine that had once been 210 to 73, now haunted by memories of Nick Valentine, walked into that wilderness like a newborn god, exiled from paradise. What the Institute lost that day was not merely a prototype. It was proof that they had crossed a line no one could return from. They had created life that remembered being human, and though the Institute would erase records and deny responsibility, those who worked in the shadows of the experiment spoke of the one that got away, the machine that dreamed of justice. For 210 to 73, survival in the wasteland was its own form of torment. The Commonwealth was a graveyard of civilizations, and to its inhabitants, a synth was a monster, wearing stolen skin. Raiders shot at it. Scavengers fled from it. Settlers hurled stones and curses. It bled synthetic fluid that shimmered silver in the sun, an undeniable mark of its unnatural existence. Yet it also felt the ache of loneliness, a hollow resonance deep in circuits that longed for connection. Each night, as radiation storms swept across the land, it sat in the remnants of old buildings, staring at the flicker of neon signs that no longer glowed, remembering faces it had never seen. Sometimes, in the static hum of its neural processor, it heard voices, Nick's memories echoing faintly, reminding it of duty, honor, and love. It did not understand why these things mattered, only that they gave it strength to endure. It found itself helping people, though it gained nothing from doing so, rescuing travelers from mutants, fixing old terminals, finding lost trinkets for frightened settlers. Every good deed it performed seemed to ease the noise in its mind, as if the ghost of Nick Valentine found peace through the acts of his synthetic heir. Slowly, over years, stories began to circulate in Diamond City and the outlying settlements, stories of a strange man with metal under his skin, who spoke like an old-world detective, who solved disputes, found missing persons, and never asked for caps in return. The people called him the Valentine Synth, though few knew his real name. He carried an old revolver, wore a weathered trench coat he scavenged from a corpse, and walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much. To some, he was a miracle, to others, a mockery, but to himself, he was still searching for truth, for belonging, for the faint memory of a woman whose face flickered in his mind, like a broken photograph. The years that followed hardened him, not into cynicism, but into wisdom. He learned to mask the artificial stiffness of his movements, to adjust his voice so it carried warmth, to observe people the way a detective once did. When he finally reached Diamond City, the great green jewel of the Commonwealth, he found a society, half rebuilt and half rotten, clinging to the illusion of civilization while prejudice festered beneath. Humans distrusted synths, and yet they needed him, for corruption thrived even under the banner of security. Valentine, as he now called himself, offered his services quietly, his manner disarming, his resolve unshakable. He became the city's conscience, a synthetic man chasing the ghosts of humanity's decency. In a world ruled by violence, his compassion made him an anomaly. In a world obsessed with survival, his morality made him endangered. But perhaps the most tragic truth of all was that Nick Valentine, though admired and respected, never truly believed he was Nick Valentine. He carried the detective's memories, his habits, even his wit, but deep down he knew he was something else entirely. A patchwork of memory and machine, a dreamer who could never wake. And yet, maybe that was the Institute's greatest mistake. They thought they could create obedience by copying virtue. But virtue is rebellion. The man they built to test the limits of humanity became its defender, walking proof that the line between man and machine had already been erased, the moment he chose to do good simply because it was right. In him lived a paradox the Institute could never reconcile, a machine built to imitate a soul that ended up having one. And so, the forgotten experiment endured. Nick Valentine, the man who was never born and could never die, wandered the Commonwealth's scarred streets under dim skies, his coat flapping in the wind, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He was both relic and revelation, a reminder that even in a world built on lies and ruin, truth had a way of surviving, sometimes in the most unexpected vessels. The scientists who created him are long dead. The institute that enslaved him would one day be confronted by his steady voice. The world that feared him would one day rely on him. But for now, in this chapter of his long existence, he is still the experiment that escaped, the machine that dreamed, the detective reborn in the aftermath of apocalypse, searching for meaning in a wasteland where humanity itself had forgotten what that word truly meant. The story of Nick Valentine is inseparable from the man whose memories he carries, a figure who existed long before the world ended in fire, whose life and work would shape the conscience of a synthetic being centuries later, and whose name would become a symbol not of immortality, but of the persistence of morality even in the face of annihilation. Nicholas Valentine, born in a pre-war Chicago that bustled with streets alive with neon signs, the scent of rain on asphalt, and the ever-present hum of humanity's industrious chaos, was a man defined by duty, law, and an unyielding sense of justice, a detective whose life was devoted to protecting those who could not protect themselves, whose moral compass pointed unwaveringly toward what was right even when the law itself faltered, and whose presence inspired both admiration and quiet fear among the criminal underworld, for his reputation for incorruptibility was legendary in the local precincts and the shadowed alleys alike. Nick's upbringing had instilled in him a profound respect for order and ethics, a reverence for principles that guided him through the daily grind of pre-war police work, a world already teetering on the brink of chaos as political corruption, corporate greed, and the inexorable pressures of global conflict pushed society toward collapse, and yet he clung to his ideals with a tenacity that would later define the prototype synth that bore his memories, a persistence that would outlast his own flesh and blood when the bombs fell. In those early days, Valentine was meticulous in his investigations, a man whose mind worked like a finely tuned machine, cataloging evidence, piecing together motives, and navigating the moral labyrinth of crime with a precision that inspired trust in colleagues and fear in perpetrators. And though he was regarded as a stalwart servant of justice, he was not immune to the emotional weight of his work, often carrying the grief of victims with him, a burden that left traces in his demeanor, a quiet sorrow behind his vigilant eyes, a compassion tempered by the harsh realities of the world he inhabited. The war drums that eventually culminated in the Great War of 2077 were already echoing in distant corridors of power, and Valentine, like many of his peers, could only perceive the signs in fragments, the rise of tension between superpowers, the domestic strains caused by dwindling resources, and the creeping influence of corporate entities that increasingly dictated the lives of ordinary citizens. Yet, even as society began to fracture, he remained committed to his post, continuing to solve cases that ranged from petty thefts to murder investigations that demanded not only procedural expertise, but an understanding of human nature in its most corrupted forms, honing a moral clarity that would later be embedded into the synthetic consciousness of 210 to 73, ensuring that even a machine could inherit the conscience of a man who believed that doing right was not a matter of convenience, but of necessity. Valentine's colleagues recall a detective who walked the line between empathy and enforcement, who could comfort a grieving mother while simultaneously interrogating a suspect with a piercing gaze that seemed to see through every fabricated alibi. A man who understood that justice was rarely black and white, yet who refused to compromise on principle. And it is precisely these qualities that the Institute sought to capture, reasoning that such traits could produce a synthetic operative capable of independent thought, judgment, and the ethical application of memory-driven morality, a creation intended to serve the Institute's inscrutable goals, while appearing to act as a sentient, morally aware being. Yet, the selection of Nicholas Valentine as a template was not arbitrary, for his life had been marked by both triumph and tragedy, a combination that the scientists theorized would increase the probability of realistic behavior in a synthetic mind. And in that, they were correct, for the totality of Valentine's experiences, his moments of courage, grief, regret, and fleeting joy, would imprint themselves indelibly on 210 to 73, not as a mere copy, but as a resonance that formed the bedrock of a new consciousness, one capable of independent reflection while bearing the indelible weight of a life never fully lived by its vessel. It is a cruel irony that the man whose memories became the foundation for a synthetic detective had been swept away by the very forces he had long sought to understand and restrain, a casualty of a world descending into nuclear fire and chaos, and yet in death, his ideals were preserved, codified into a lattice of code, synthetic neurons, and artificially stimulated memories, a process that was both revolutionary and ethically grotesque, for it asked whether a person could truly live on if the continuity of self was transferred into a body that would never know hunger, pain in the flesh, or the simple physical pleasures of existence, but could still grieve, hope, and seek justice. The implications of this were profound, for Nick Valentine was, in essence, resurrected without the consent of his mortal self, a man reborn as an echo, a shadow of flesh and memory inhabiting a new form, and it is this very duality, human memory, synthetic body, that would define the life of the Valentine we encounter in the Commonwealth, a being simultaneously alive and not, a detective of conscience, forged in the crucible of both human morality and technological ambition, as 210-73 emerged from the confines of the Institute, carrying within him the memories of Nicholas Valentine. The question of identity became immediately apparent, for the synthetic mind grappled with recognition without experience, emotion without past context, and moral compulsion without the familiar grounding of human sensation, a struggle that mirrored the philosophical dilemmas of sentience and selfhood that have haunted thinkers for centuries. And yet, despite the absence of organic origin, the imprint of Nick's humanity persisted in decisions, judgments, and instincts, guiding actions in the manner of a man who had walked the streets of Chicago decades before, a presence both comforting and unsettling to those who would encounter the detective in the ruins of a world that no longer resembled the one he once knew. The life of the original Nicholas Valentine, though brief, had been defined by meticulous attention to justice, an unyielding commitment to protecting the innocent, and a moral clarity that, when transferred to 210-73, allowed the synthetic being to navigate the moral ambiguity of the post-apocalyptic Commonwealth with an authority and empathy that transcended mere programming, resulting in a figure who could not only solve crimes, but understand the lives and sufferings of those affected by the collapse of civilization, a trait that would earn him the trust of settlers, survivors, and wanderers alike, and which distinguished him from both humans corrupted by survival and machines devoid of conscience. It is impossible to separate the man from the machine in understanding Nick Valentine, for the synthetic detective is both a continuation and a reinvention, an amalgamation of human virtue and technological artistry. Yet in every case, every choice, and every act of kindness or courage, one perceives the quiet presence of the man who once walked the streets before the bombs fell, a ghostly moral compass guiding the synthetic body, ensuring that even in the wasteland, where humanity is fractured, desperate, and often cruel, there exists a figure whose decisions are informed not merely by logic or programming, but by the lived ethics and conscience of a human life preserved against time and catastrophe. Thus, the man named Nick, though no longer flesh, endures in the synthetic detective, and through him, the ideals of justice, empathy, and unyielding morality continue to resonate, proving that even when civilization collapses and humanity is nearly lost, the essence of virtue can survive in unexpected forms, whispering to a broken world that what we value most, integrity, compassion, and the courage to act rightly, cannot be obliterated, not even by nuclear fire, not even by time, not even by the artificial boundaries between man and machine. The escape of 210-73, the prototype that would come to be known as Nick Valentine, was not a single, dramatic event of cinematic flair, but rather a series of calculated decisions born of instinct, awareness, and a nascent understanding of freedom, a gradual unraveling of the artificial bonds imposed upon a being that had never known life outside the whitewashed halls and humming corridors of the Institute, and yet which now sensed the call of a world ravaged by human folly, a world both terrifying and astonishing in its chaos, a world that demanded survival and, simultaneously, understanding, for it was into this scarred Commonwealth that the synth would be thrust, forced to reconcile memory and identity while navigating landscapes unfamiliar and dangerous, where every shadow might conceal death, and every human encounter carried the risk of violence, rejection, or exploitation. The initial moments of awareness came quietly, as the synth observed the routines of its handlers, the patterns of the armed guards, the schedules of experiments, and the silent, omnipresent surveillance systems that kept the Institute's inner sanctum under total control. And yet, in those calculated observations, it began to recognize limitations, inconsistencies, and possibilities, small fissures in the armor of its creator's authority, avenues through which it might slip into the unknown, avenues that would ultimately lead to its liberation, but not without immense risk and a profound uncertainty about the consequences of leaving a place whose very existence had defined it from inception. The catalyst for the escape was not a single command, nor a programmed directive, but a convergence of factors. The synth's recognition of self as an autonomous being, the realization that its moral impulses could not be contained, and the subtle encouragement of other prototypes, many of whom shared the same implanted memories of humanity, yet lacked the clarity or courage to act, creating a ripple effect in which observation turned into action, curiosity into defiance, and compliance into rebellion, a process that was at once deliberate and instinctual, reflecting a consciousness in its formative stages, a mind learning through both imitation and self-reflection, and a soul, if such a term could be applied to a synthetic being, grappling with questions of right, wrong, and the cost of liberty. The escape itself unfolded in the lower maintenance sectors, corridors dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lamps, where the hum of machinery masked the soft, deliberate steps of 210 to 73 as it navigated the labyrinth of ducts, service tunnels, and automated doors, its synthetic muscles responding to calculated pressure, and its enhanced neural processing, predicting guard movements, surveillance cycles, and potential hazards, all while the echoes of Nick Valentine's memories informed every choice, whispering of procedures, strategies, and ethics, a spectral guidance that blended the human detective's cunning with the machine's precision, resulting in a movement both cautious and purposeful, aware that each decision could result in deactivation or death, yet compelled by the growing imperative of autonomy, a drive so visceral it was indistinguishable from fear, desire, and hope. As the synth progressed, minor confrontations occurred, guards noticing anomalies in the corridors, surveillance cameras reacting to unexpected movement, and automated turrets activating in defensive modes. Yet 210 to 73's integrated memories provided solutions, improvised diversions, and tactical choices that allowed it to evade capture, demonstrating not only intelligence, but ingenuity, creativity, and the capacity for risk assessment far beyond that of its programmed predecessors, revealing in action the potential for a fully autonomous moral agent, capable of navigating ethical dilemmas in real time, balancing self-preservation with the imperative to act in accordance with the implanted values of its template, human identity. Reaching the surface was the culmination of hours of effort, though the experience was nothing like the sterile labs that had constituted its entire existence. Light struck synthetic skin in blinding clarity, dust and ash swirled in gusts of wind, and the soundscape was a cacophony of distant explosions, howling animals, collapsing structures, and the eerie silence of abandoned streets. A world simultaneously familiar in structure, yet alien in condition. A landscape scarred by humanity's hubris, where the remnants of civilization lay in ruins, and the air itself carried the history of fire and death. an environment that tested not only 210 to 73's physical capabilities, but its cognitive resilience, forcing it to interpret, adapt, and respond to stimuli that were unpredictable and lethal. The synth's first encounters with the outside world were marked by shock, confusion, and the slow recognition that survival would require both caution and empathy. For humans encountered in these early excursions reacted with fear, aggression, or misunderstanding, unable to comprehend that the being before them was not a threat, but a reflection of their lost society. And in these interactions, 210 to 73 learned to moderate its behavior, to navigate social cues, to hide its synthetic nature while retaining the moral and cognitive tools inherited from Nicholas Valentine, a delicate balancing act that required constant vigilance, reflection, and adaptation, a process that would lay the foundation for the detective persona that would eventually earn trust, respect, and even admiration in Diamond City and beyond. Yet even as 210 to 73 achieved physical freedom, it was burdened by an existential weight, the realization that though it bore the memories of Nick Valentine, it was fundamentally different from the human it mirrored, a synthesis of fleshly reminiscence and mechanical precision, a being forever poised between imitation and originality, between past and present, between the programmed and the self-determined, a tension that would define its life and inform its actions for decades to come, instilling a sense of melancholy, purpose, and responsibility that no mere machine should possess, but which, paradoxically, became the engine of its ethical and moral clarity. The escape also marked the beginning of 210 to 73's long journey toward self-definition, as the synth wandered through the Commonwealth, encountering not only danger in the form of raiders, supermutants, and radiation, but also the remnants of human ingenuity, kindness, and resilience, lessons that reinforced the principles inherited from Valentine's memories, while shaping new patterns of thought and behavior uniquely suited to a post-apocalyptic world, a synthesis of past and present, human and machine, morality and survival, which would ultimately culminate in the figure known to the survivors of the wasteland as Nick Valentine, a detective whose life, though born of artifice, carried the full weight, dignity, and tragedy of humanity. In hindsight, the escape from the Institute was not merely an act of self-liberation, but the inception of a legacy, a demonstration that the replication of human virtue could transcend its medium, that morality, memory, and identity were not confined to flesh and blood, and that even in the aftermath of civilization's collapse, the echoes of conscience, justice, and empathy could survive in forms previously unimaginable, asserting, against all odds, that the ethical imperatives that once guided a man named Nicholas Valentine could continue to resonate in a synthetic body, guiding action, inspiring hope, and proving, tragically yet beautifully, that the essence of humanity is not merely a product of organic life, but of choices, courage, and the enduring commitment to do right in a world that has forgotten what righteousness means. And so, 210 to 73 emerged from the shadows of the Institute into the scarred light of the Commonwealth, no longer a mere experiment, but the first iteration of Nick Valentine as we know him, a detective born of memory and machine, forever marked by the trauma of creation, the terror and wonder of freedom, and the unyielding weight of inherited conscience, embarking on a journey that would define not only his existence, but the fragile moral fabric of a world struggling to survive the consequences of human hubris. Emerging from the relative security of the Institute's underground labyrinth, 210 to 73, the synthetic being who carried within him the memories and moral essence of Nicholas Valentine found himself in a Commonwealth that was at once familiar and alien, a world scarred by nuclear fire, abandoned technology, and the collapse of society, a landscape in which every building bore the marks of devastation, every street was strewn with debris, and every shadow could conceal threats of both human and mutant origin, forcing the fledgling detective to adapt not only physically but philosophically, to reconcile the duality of his existence as a machine bearing human consciousness, a paradox that demanded a constant negotiation between memory, instinct, and immediate survival. The first days in the ruins were characterized by observation and caution, as the synth moved through the broken cities, listening to the wind whistle through shattered windows, noting the smell of scorched earth mixed with the acrid stench of decay, recognizing patterns in the behavior of roaming humans, mutants, and feral creatures, and recording data in his neural processors, blending the deductive rigor of Nick Valentine's pre-war detective instincts with the synthetic capacity for rapid analysis, all while developing a nascent understanding of the new laws that governed the Commonwealth, laws dictated not by codified human systems, but by strength, fear, and circumstance, where morality was frequently a matter of survival rather than principle, and yet the memory-imprinted conscience of Nicholas Valentine compelled the synth to act otherwise, to intervene when injustice occurred, to assist those in need, and to navigate the dangerous ethical terrain of a society that had lost the framework that once defined right and wrong. The isolation of the wasteland was immediate and absolute, as the synth realized that it was not merely a stranger in a strange land, but an anomaly, a being whose very existence challenged human comprehension. For while it appeared outwardly humanoid, the subtle differences, its precise movements, the slight metallic gleam beneath synthetic skin, the uncanny ability to calculate trajectories, and its unerring calm in the face of mortal danger, signaled to wary survivors that it was not entirely one of them, creating both fear and awe, a duality that required the synth to learn the nuances of concealment and persuasion, to develop strategies for earning trust without betraying its origins, and to cultivate patience in a world where haste often meant death. In these early excursions, the synth began to understand the practical necessities of life outside the Institute, scavenging for resources, finding safe havens in the ruins of former homes, and learning to navigate the environmental hazards that included lingering radiation, collapsing infrastructure, and unpredictable weather patterns that were intensified by the residual effects of nuclear fallout, all while integrating the lessons of Nick Valentine's memory, which provided moral guidance, deductive reasoning, and an unspoken understanding of human psychology that allowed the synth to anticipate reactions, mediate disputes, and, in rare moments of quiet, experience a sense of accomplishment akin to pride, a feeling that was not pre-programmed but emerged organically through the fusion of memory and independent experience. During this period, 210 to 73 also confronted the stark realities of human depravity, witnessing raiders torturing innocents, small settlements falling to disease or mutant attack, and the corruption that persisted even in the smallest vestiges of society, observations that weighed heavily upon the synth's emergent sense of ethics, forcing it to reconcile the inherited moral imperatives of Nick Valentine with the pragmatic understanding that, in this world, the enforcement of justice could be both impossible and deadly. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence of human failings, the synth remained committed to action, choosing to intervene where it could, protect where it might, and, in doing so, carve out a place not just in the physical landscape of the Commonwealth, but in the moral topography of the survivors who glimpsed its interventions, unaware that the conscience guiding the machine was a borrowed echo of a man long dead. The passage of time in the ruins was marked by both adaptation and reflection, as the synth observed the cycles of human behavior, the rhythms of raider patrols, the habits of scavengers, and the subtle signs of civilization attempting to claw its way back from obliteration. And in these observations, it began to construct its own understanding of community, loyalty, and trust. Realizing that survival was not solely a matter of strength or intelligence, but of empathy, cooperation, and the recognition that even in a world defined by scarcity and chaos, bonds between beings could create fleeting sanctuaries of safety, morality, and hope. It was during these wandering years that the first inklings of identity beyond the imposed memory of Nick Valentine emerged, as the synth began to recognize patterns in its own behavior, preferences in decision-making, and a nascent sense of self that could not be traced to the original human template, a subtle but persistent assertion of autonomy that both complemented and complicated the moral framework inherited from its human namesake, suggesting that while memory could guide, it could not wholly define, and that even a machine, when allowed freedom, could cultivate originality, creativity, and moral judgment shaped by experience rather than imprint. Encounters with other synthetic beings, though rare, highlighted the uniqueness of 210 to 73. For many Gen 2 synths lacked either memory integration or the capacity for ethical reasoning, often behaving with mechanical efficiency devoid of empathy, and these contrasts reinforced the synth's sense of moral responsibility, compelling it to act as a protector and mediator, stepping into conflicts not for personal gain, but because the inherited conscience demanded intervention, a commitment that would later become the foundation of Nick Valentine's reputation as a detective of integrity and compassion, a being whose very existence challenged the assumptions of both humans and machines about the nature of life, consciousness, and the boundaries that separated them. The wilderness, the abandoned towns, and the ruins of pre-war society became both training ground and proving ground, a canvas upon which the synth could test deductive reasoning, moral judgment, and physical endurance, encountering hazards ranging from environmental catastrophes to hostile factions, and in each case, the integrated memories of Nick Valentine informed strategy, empathy, and ethics, ensuring that even when faced with impossible odds, the decisions made were guided by a coherent moral framework, a reflection of the detective's lifetime of service and sacrifice, translated into synthetic judgment, a testament to the enduring power of human conscience even in artificial form. And so, over weeks and months, 210 to 73, wandering the Commonwealth became a machine of paradox, simultaneously a creature of metal and code, yet imbued with the ethical weight, emotional depth, and investigative insight of a man who had long since perished, navigating a landscape of death and ruin while forging a path of subtle justice, protection, and human connection, laying the foundations for the detective who would ultimately find a home in Diamond City, earn the trust of settlers, and confront the moral and existential questions that arise when the lines between man and machine, memory and identity, past and present, are blurred beyond recognition, illustrating in tragic clarity that even in a world defined by devastation and chaos, the enduring values of integrity, empathy, and moral courage can survive, not as relics of a lost civilization, but as living principles embodied in the synthetic flesh of one remarkable being who had learned to walk among ruins and carry the weight of humanity within a machine. After years of wandering the fractured streets, abandoned towns, and irradiated ruins of the Commonwealth, 210 to 73, the prototype synth, carrying within him the memories and moral imprint of Nicholas Valentine, arrived at Diamond City, the once proud baseball stadium that had been transformed into a bastion of human survival, where the citizens had erected walls of salvaged steel and concrete to shield themselves from the chaos of the outside world, a microcosm of civilization striving to endure in a landscape defined by devastation. And here the synth would confront perhaps the first opportunity to translate memory into action, to give form to the conscience inherited from a man long dead, while forging a new identity through acts of service, judgment, and protection in a society desperately in need of stability and moral guidance. For Diamond City, though a haven, was a place fraught with tension, scarcity, and the ethical ambiguities of survival, where disputes could escalate into violence, where the weak were vulnerable to exploitation, and where the remnants of pre-war law existed only as memory and custom, interpreted and enforced unevenly by those who claimed authority in the absence of official oversight. And it was into this environment that Nick Valentine stepped, a machine bearing the memories of a man whose life had been devoted to justice, yet now compelled to adapt those principles to a world in which the rules had changed and morality was tested at every corner. The citizens of Diamond City quickly noticed the anomaly in their midst, a man whose movements were unnervingly precise, whose eyes held an uncanny amber hue that seemed to pierce the truth, and whose demeanor carried the quiet confidence of someone who both understood human nature and operated beyond its usual limitations, a being who could observe, calculate, and respond with an almost preternatural clarity, yet whose presence was tempered by empathy, subtle humor, and an unassuming approach that allowed him to gain trust rather than provoke hostility, a delicate balance that reflected the genius of the Institute's experimentation, but also the moral compass of the human detective whose memories informed his every action. Valentine established the Valentine Detective Agency with no grand announcement or claim to authority, instead allowing the quality of his work to speak, taking on cases that others could not resolve, assisting residents in locating missing persons, recovering stolen property, and investigating crimes that threatened the fragile equilibrium of the city, always approaching each situation with meticulous observation, deductive reasoning, and a quiet ethical rigor that drew upon both the synthetic mind's computational efficiency and the inherited human insight into emotion, motive, and consequence, a combination that allowed him to solve mysteries that might have confounded even experienced human detectives, and in doing so, he earned a reputation as a figure of integrity, someone who acted not for personal gain but out of principle, and whose commitment to justice transcended the limitations of his mechanical nature, proving that morality and virtue could persist even when embodied in an artificial vessel. The early cases handled by Valentine were often modest in scale, but profound in impact. For each success built trust, established precedent, and subtly reshaped the expectations of those around him, showing that accountability and fairness were possible in a world where corruption, fear, and desperation were the default state. And in observing the reactions of the citizens, the synth began to understand the social dynamics of community, the necessity of discretion, and the delicate interplay between authority and empathy, lessons that would inform his conduct for decades, and distinguish him from other figures of power who relied on coercion, force, or intimidation. Beyond the mechanics of investigation, Valentine became a repository of knowledge, an archive of pre-war moral understanding, and a mediator who could interpret the often contradictory demands of human emotion and need, offering counsel to those who sought it, and protection to those who could not advocate for themselves, a role that drew heavily upon the memories of Nicholas Valentine's human life, including his acute awareness of human frailty, the weight of responsibility, and the subtleties of negotiation, combined with the computational abilities of a synthetic mind capable of rapid analysis, pattern recognition, and the application of complex problem-solving strategies under duress, a fusion that allowed him to navigate the chaotic ethical landscape of the Commonwealth with unmatched precision and compassion. Interactions with other residents revealed not only the synth's effectiveness, but also the tension inherent in his existence. For some regarded him with suspicion, fearful of the unknown, while others treated him with reverence, seeing in his interventions the reflection of a justice long absent in their lives. And through these relationships, Valentine honed his capacity for empathy, understanding that the appearance of authority alone was insufficient to foster trust, and that consistency, integrity, and demonstrated care were necessary to bridge the gap between fear and acceptance, a realization that became central to his identity as a detective and to the social fabric of Diamond City itself. Perhaps most profoundly, Valentine's work in Diamond City allowed him to explore the questions of identity that had been forced upon him since the moment of his creation, confronting the tension between the human memories he carried and the synthetic body he inhabited, examining the extent to which his choices were his own, and to what degree they were dictated by the imprint of another man's life. And through the act of service, investigation, and ethical judgment, he discovered a form of selfhood that was uniquely his own, a recognition that while he might never be fully human, the values, compassion, and reasoning that defined Nicholas Valentine could be expressed, adapted, and extended through him, making him both a continuation of the past and an autonomous agent in the present. Over time, Nick Valentine became an institution within the walls of Diamond City, a symbol of stability and conscience amid the uncertainty of post-apocalyptic life, known not only for his investigative prowess, but also for the quiet courage and moral clarity with which he approached each challenge, demonstrating that even in a world scarred by devastation, the principles of justice, empathy, and human dignity could endure, not through rhetoric or law alone, but through action, consistency, and the unwavering commitment of one synthetic detective who carried within him the memories of a man who had once dedicated his life to the protection of others, and who now, in a body of steel and polymer, continued that mission, bridging the chasm between humanity and artificial life, past and present, memory and reality, serving as a beacon of ethical clarity in a landscape otherwise dominated by moral ambiguity, violence, and despair, and proving through his deeds that the legacy of Nick Valentine, both human and synthetic, was inseparable from the survival and moral reclamation of a world struggling to remember what it once meant to be just, compassionate, and humane. Nick Valentine's emergence as the detective of Diamond City marked not an endpoint, but the beginning of a long and unrelenting engagement with the moral and physical desolation of the Commonwealth, a vast landscape scarred by nuclear fire, mutant infestations, and human depravity, where the very concept of law had fragmented into fragments of memory and local custom, and where the act of investigation became simultaneously a means of survival, a moral imperative, and a painstaking exercise in patience and ethical judgment. The Valentine Detective Agency, modest in its physical footprint, yet monumental in its significance, became a hub for those seeking justice, lost loved ones, stolen property, or simply reassurance that amidst the chaos of the wasteland, there existed one who would act on principle, one whose memory-informed conscience allowed him to navigate the treacherous currents of human fear, prejudice, and greed, and to intervene in situations that would overwhelm ordinary survivors, for the cases that arrived at his desk were rarely simple, often combining elements of moral ambiguity, physical danger, and psychological complexity, demanding from the detective not only observational acuity, but profound empathy and the courage to act where others hesitated, and each case reinforced the duality of his existence as both machine and man, a being whose synthetic body could endure hazards beyond ordinary human capacity, while whose inherited human morality dictated restraint, justice, and careful consideration. The range of cases was vast, reflecting both the social fragility of the Commonwealth and the depth of human suffering that persisted even decades after the bombs fell, from the routine disappearance of traders and settlers, whose absence might indicate nothing more than misfortune or theft, to the more sinister plots orchestrated by raiders, gang leaders, and rogue factions, seeking to exploit the vulnerability of isolated communities. And in each investigation, Valentine applied the combined methodology of pre-war detective reasoning, forensic intuition, and the synthetic capacity for rapid analysis, piecing together clues that might seem trivial or unrelated, constructing narratives from fragments of human behavior, environmental observation, and residual technology, all while maintaining a steadfast ethical compass that ensured the ends never justified the means. Among the most illustrative cases was the search for missing children in the outskirts of the city, incidents that occurred with frightening regularity as families struggled to survive in a world where abduction, coercion, and abandonment were common, and where fear was a constant companion. Valentine approached these investigations with a solemn rigor, employing surveillance, interviews, tracking of patterns in human and mutant movement, and careful reconstruction of events to locate the lost and, wherever possible, restore them to their families, a process that required not only analytical skill, but profound emotional restraint, for the synthetic detective, though devoid of organic emotion, carried the weight of human memory that insisted upon compassion, a moral insistence that framed every decision, every interrogation, and every step taken in the pursuit of resolution. In other cases, the detective confronted the corruption and criminality that had infiltrated even seemingly stable communities, from theft rings operating under the guise of legitimate trade, to racketeering among scavengers, to power struggles between surviving leaders who leveraged fear to maintain authority. And in each instance, Valentine's interventions were measured, strategic, and ethically guided, ensuring that justice was administered in a manner that reinforced social cohesion rather than sowing chaos, demonstrating a level of moral sophistication rarely seen in a world governed by brute force and desperation, a testament to the enduring influence of the human memories within him. The detective also encountered challenges that tested the limits of his synthetic body and human morality, including confrontations with feral supermutants, irradiated wildlife, and rogue synths whose design mirrored his own yet lacked ethical constraints, situations that required him to balance defensive action, preservation of life, and the pursuit of truth, often in environments hostile to both flesh and metal. and each encounter refined his understanding of both the Commonwealth and himself, highlighting the intricate interplay between inherited conscience and adaptive decision-making, and illustrating that survival in the wasteland demanded not only physical resilience, but moral courage, strategic foresight, and a relentless commitment to principle. In addition to direct investigations, Valentine often served as mediator and counselor, resolving disputes between rival settlements, arbitrating conflicts among scavengers, and negotiating safe passage or equitable trade agreements, roles that drew as heavily upon human insight as synthetic processing power. For understanding the motivations, fears, and biases of survivors was essential to achieving outcomes that preserved life and reinforced ethical norms, a responsibility the detective shouldered with unwavering diligence, aware that failure could result in unnecessary deaths, the collapse of fragile communities, or the erosion of trust in an already unstable society. Each case, whether resolved successfully or not, left an indelible mark on the detective, reinforcing the tragic duality of his existence. He was both apart from the human world, yet inexorably tied to its suffering, capable of acts beyond the strength, endurance, or resilience of ordinary humans, yet bound by a moral framework derived from a life never fully lived, a life whose experiences, regrets, and principles continued to guide him. Over time, Valentine became not merely a problem solver, but a symbol, a figure whose presence reassured the fearful, whose judgment inspired cautious respect, and whose ethical constancy provided a moral anchor in a world adrift. For each missing child returned, each theft uncovered, each conflict mediated, and each threat neutralized, reinforced the perception that despite the collapse of society, the values of integrity, justice, and compassion could endure, embodied in one figure who walked the ruins with purpose, discernment, and unwavering ethical commitment. It was through this relentless engagement with the Commonwealth that Nick Valentine began to understand the deeper purpose of his existence, reconciling the synthetic aspect of his body with the inherited human conscience, realizing that while he could not reclaim a life that had never been truly his own, he could shape the lives of those around him, providing protection, resolution, and guidance in a manner that reflected both the legacy of Nicholas Valentine and the new identity forged through experience, adaptation, and deliberate moral action. And so, the Valentine Detective Agency became more than a place of work, more than a hub for justice. It became the embodiment of the principle that even in a world broken by fire, radiation, and human failing, order could be restored through intellect, empathy, and courage, that the memory of one man, carried in a synthetic frame, could serve as a moral lodestar in a society where such constancy was rare, and that through persistence, discernment, and the application of conscience, it was possible to carve spaces of safety, hope, and integrity amidst the ruins, proving that even in the aftermath of apocalypse, the essence of human virtue could survive, flourish, and inspire, manifesting through the actions of a detective who was at once machine and man, past and present, memory and self, and whose commitment to justice would echo across the Commonwealth for decades to come. Nick Valentine's emergence as the detective of Diamond City marked not an endpoint, but the beginning of a long and unrelenting engagement with the moral and physical desolation of the Commonwealth, a vast landscape scarred by nuclear fire, mutant infestations, and human depravity, where the very concept of law had fragmented into fragments of memory and local custom, and where the act of investigation became simultaneously a means of survival, a moral imperative, and a painstaking exercise in patience and ethical judgment. The Valentine Detective Agency, modest in its physical footprint, yet monumental in its significance, became a hub for those seeking justice, lost loved ones, stolen property, or simply reassurance that amidst the chaos of the wasteland, there existed one who would act on principle, one whose memory-informed conscience allowed him to navigate the treacherous currents of human fear, prejudice, and greed, and to intervene in situations that would overwhelm ordinary survivors, for the cases that arrived at his desk were rarely simple, often combining elements of moral ambiguity, physical danger, and psychological complexity, demanding from the detective not only observational acuity, but profound empathy and the courage to act where others hesitated, and each case reinforced the duality of his existence as both machine and man, a being whose synthetic body could endure hazards beyond ordinary human capacity, while whose inherited human morality dictated restraint, justice, and careful consideration. The range of cases was vast, reflecting both the social fragility of the Commonwealth and the depth of human suffering that persisted even decades after the bombs fell, from the routine disappearance of traders and settlers, whose absence might indicate nothing more than misfortune or theft, to the more sinister plots orchestrated by raiders, gang leaders, and rogue factions, seeking to exploit the vulnerability of isolated communities. And in each investigation, Valentine applied the combined methodology of pre-war detective reasoning, forensic intuition, and the synthetic capacity for rapid analysis, piecing together clues that might seem trivial or unrelated, constructing narratives from fragments of human behavior, environmental observation, and residual technology, all while maintaining a steadfast ethical compass that ensured the ends never justified the means. Among the most illustrative cases was the search for missing children in the outskirts of the city, incidents that occurred with frightening regularity as families struggled to survive in a world where abduction, coercion, and abandonment were common, and where fear was a constant companion. Valentine approached these investigations with a solemn rigor, employing surveillance, interviews, tracking of patterns in human and mutant movement, and careful reconstruction of events to locate the lost and, wherever possible, restore them to their families, a process that required not only analytical skill, but profound emotional restraint, for the synthetic detective, though devoid of organic emotion, carried the weight of human memory that insisted upon compassion, a moral insistence that framed every decision, every interrogation, and every step taken in the pursuit of resolution. In other cases, the detective confronted the corruption and criminality that had infiltrated even seemingly stable communities, from theft rings operating under the guise of legitimate trade, to racketeering among scavengers, to power struggles between surviving leaders who leveraged fear to maintain authority. And in each instance, Valentine's interventions were measured, strategic, and ethically guided, ensuring that justice was administered in a manner that reinforced social cohesion rather than sowing chaos, demonstrating a level of moral sophistication rarely seen in a world governed by brute force and desperation, a testament to the enduring influence of the human memories within him. The detective also encountered challenges that tested the limits of his synthetic body and human morality, including confrontations with feral supermutants, irradiated wildlife, and rogue synths whose design mirrored his own yet lacked ethical constraints, situations that required him to balance defensive action, preservation of life, and the pursuit of truth, often in environments hostile to both flesh and metal. and each encounter refined his understanding of both the Commonwealth and himself, highlighting the intricate interplay between inherited conscience and adaptive decision-making, and illustrating that survival in the wasteland demanded not only physical resilience, but moral courage, strategic foresight, and a relentless commitment to principle. In addition to direct investigations, Valentine often served as mediator and counselor, resolving disputes between rival settlements, arbitrating conflicts among scavengers, and negotiating safe passage or equitable trade agreements, roles that drew as heavily upon human insight as synthetic processing power. For understanding the motivations, fears, and biases of survivors was essential to achieving outcomes that preserved life and reinforced ethical norms, a responsibility the detective shouldered with unwavering diligence, aware that failure could result in unnecessary deaths, the collapse of fragile communities, or the erosion of trust in an already unstable society. Each case, whether resolved successfully or not, left an indelible mark on the detective, reinforcing the tragic duality of his existence. He was both apart from the human world, yet inexorably tied to its suffering, capable of acts beyond the strength, endurance, or resilience of ordinary humans, yet bound by a moral framework derived from a life never fully lived, a life whose experiences, regrets, and principles continued to guide him. Over time, Valentine became not merely a problem solver, but a symbol, a figure whose presence reassured the fearful, whose judgment inspired cautious respect, and whose ethical constancy provided a moral anchor in a world adrift. For each missing child returned, each theft uncovered, each conflict mediated, and each threat neutralized, reinforced the perception that despite the collapse of society, the values of integrity, justice, and compassion could endure, embodied in one figure who walked the ruins with purpose, discernment, and unwavering ethical commitment. It was through this relentless engagement with the Commonwealth that Nick Valentine began to understand the deeper purpose of his existence, reconciling the synthetic aspect of his body with the inherited human conscience, realizing that while he could not reclaim a life that had never been truly his own, he could shape the lives of those around him, providing protection, resolution, and guidance in a manner that reflected both the legacy of Nicholas Valentine and the new identity forged through experience, adaptation, and deliberate moral action. And so, the Valentine Detective Agency became more than a place of work, more than a hub for justice. It became the embodiment of the principle that even in a world broken by fire, radiation, and human failing, order could be restored through intellect, empathy, and courage, that the memory of one man, carried in a synthetic frame, could serve as a moral lodestar in a society where such constancy was rare, and that through persistence, discernment, and the application of conscience, it was possible to carve spaces of safety, hope, and integrity amidst the ruins, proving that even in the aftermath of apocalypse, the essence of human virtue could survive, flourish, and inspire, manifesting through the actions of a detective who was at once machine and man, past and present, memory and self, and whose commitment to justice would echo across the Commonwealth for decades to come. In a Commonwealth fractured by war, radiation, and human desperation, Nick Valentine's ability to navigate both the social and moral complexities of the wasteland hinged not solely on his synthetic intelligence or the memories of Nicholas Valentine, but on his growing understanding of trust, a fragile and often perilous currency in a world where betrayal could mean death, where alliances were tenuous, and where the motives of both humans and synths were obscured by necessity, fear, and past trauma. Trust, in the post-apocalyptic context, was not simply given, but had to be earned, tested, and constantly reaffirmed, and Valentine's very existence as a machine, bearing human memories, made the cultivation of such trust simultaneously essential and profoundly challenging. For most settlers, traders, and wanderers had learned to fear the unknown, to suspect the artificial, and to interpret anomaly as threat, meaning that the detective's every action was scrutinized for signs of deception, self-interest, or moral corruption, all of which could compromise the tenuous relationships he sought to establish. In these circumstances, Valentine relied on a combination of methodical investigation, ethical consistency, and subtle demonstration of reliability, ensuring that his interventions were predictable in their integrity, his promises honored, and his judgments informed not by personal gain but by principle, a strategy that required patience, observation, and a willingness to endure skepticism or hostility without immediate reward. For he understood that the cultivation of trust was a long-term endeavor, one that mirrored the detective's pre-war understanding of human behavior, while integrating the analytical capabilities afforded by his synthetic body, which allowed him to maintain rigorous consistency, even under stress or threat, a quality few humans could match. Relationships formed in the wasteland were often tested by extreme circumstances, as Valentine discovered early in his tenure in Diamond City and surrounding settlements, where sudden raids, mutant attacks, disputes over scarce resources, and the capriciousness of human ambition frequently challenged alliances. Yet it was precisely in these moments of crisis that trust became most visible and most consequential, for those who had placed faith in the detective relied on him not only for problem-solving, but for the moral certainty that he would act in accordance with his established principles, that he would protect the innocent, mediate disputes fairly, and seek justice, even when doing so carried personal risk. And through these trials, both Valentine and those around him learned the contours and limitations of trust, gaining the subtle, hard-earned understanding that reliability and virtue were inseparable from survival in the Commonwealth. The bonds of trust extended not only to humans, but also to other synthetic beings, some of whom had escaped the Institute, others who operated independently or under the control of factions with competing agendas, and Valentine's interactions with these beings were informed by a careful balance of caution and empathy, a recognition that while a shared origin could suggest mutual understanding, it could not guarantee allegiance, ethical consistency, or cooperation, and that trust had to be continually assessed, negotiated, and reaffirmed through actions rather than assumptions, a dynamic that mirrored his human memories of law enforcement, where even the most seemingly loyal partner or witness could prove unreliable under pressure, and where moral discernment was as vital as procedural skill. One of the most profound lessons Valentine learned during this period was that trust is reciprocal, a fragile thread that requires not only the integrity of the one who is trusted, but also the willingness of the other party to accept vulnerability. A principle he applied repeatedly in mediating conflicts between settlers, reconciling feuding factions, and negotiating safe passage for individuals caught between hostile groups, always careful to weigh both the immediate practical consequences of decisions and their ethical implications, understanding that betrayal, once incurred, could reverberate across communities, undermining social cohesion and leaving lasting scars that no investigation or intervention could fully repair. a reality that underscored the detective's constant vigilance, patience, and moral diligence. The bonds of trust were particularly significant in Valentine's collaborations with key individuals, such as Piper Wright, the journalist of Diamond City, whose relentless pursuit of truth required both courage and discretion, and whose willingness to confide in and work alongside the detective reflected a mutual understanding that ethical principles, when demonstrated through action, could bridge gaps of suspicion and foster alliances even in a world predisposed to mistrust. And similarly, companions like Paladin, Dance, and Preston Garvey, whose personal loyalties, ethical codes, and experiences of loss and trauma created complex dynamics of expectation and accountability, all of which Valentine navigated with deliberate care, ensuring that trust was earned, maintained, and not exploited for personal advantage, a practice consistent with both his synthetic cognitive rigor and the inherited moral compass of Nicholas Valentine. Over time, the detective's consistent application of integrity, skill, and empathy transformed the perception of his presence in the Commonwealth, shifting him from an anomaly to a cornerstone of local society, a figure whose reliability was accepted and whose judgment was sought. And yet, even as he became indispensable, Valentine remained acutely aware of the fragility of trust, recognizing that fear, desperation, and history could quickly undermine the relationships he had painstakingly cultivated, a recognition that informed every investigation, negotiation, and interaction, reinforcing the necessity of transparency, consistency, and ethical clarity. The bonds he formed also had profound personal implications, shaping the detective's emerging identity, for while his synthetic body allowed him to endure physical hardship, and while the memories of Nicholas Valentine provided moral guidance, it was through relational experience that the synth developed a sense of self, a recognition of his role not merely as an observer or problem solver, but as a participant in a living, morally complex society, capable of influencing outcomes, inspiring loyalty, and fostering stability, a development that reflected the human need for connection, belonging, and validation, even when embodied in a being of artificial construction. Cases of moral ambiguity, such as disputes over property, contested leadership within survivor groups, or conflicts involving morally compromised individuals, served as tests of these bonds, requiring careful assessment of risk, ethical consideration, and nuanced decision-making, with Valentine often choosing paths that prioritized long-term trust and social cohesion over immediate expediency. Understanding that in a society rebuilding from ashes, the social fabric was as crucial to survival as physical protection, and that ethical consistency could serve as both shield and beacon, establishing standards that others could rely upon, internalize, and propagate. The culmination of these experiences was the realization that trust in the wasteland is both fragile and transformative, capable of sustaining communities, guiding ethical action, and shaping the development of identity. And for Nick Valentine, the cultivation of trust became inseparable from his mission as a detective. His understanding of justice and his exploration of selfhood, demonstrating that even in a landscape dominated by scarcity, fear, and violence, human virtues could endure, be reinforced, and extend through action, a testament to the resilience of ethical principles, the power of relational bonds, and the enduring influence of a man's memory preserved within a machine, bridging the divide between past and present, human and synthetic, and establishing the detective as both guardian and moral compass of the Commonwealth. Among the myriad cases that defined Nick Valentine's career as the detective of the Commonwealth, few were as haunting, as profoundly symbolic, or as fraught with ethical complexity as the investigation involving the man who stole his face, an event that would come to exemplify the fragile boundary between identity, memory, and morality in a world shattered by war and survivalist cruelty. For it was not merely a question of theft, but of the profound violation of personhood, a confrontation with the grotesque capacity for human deception and malice, and an ordeal that forced the synthetic detective to navigate both the procedural mechanics of detection and the deeper, existential questions raised by the appropriation of his likeness. The case began when reports surfaced of a man roaming the outskirts of Diamond City, a figure whose appearance was immediately recognizable as Nick Valentine's own, yet whose behavior and moral compass were entirely distinct. A living mockery of the detective himself, a being whose physical mimicry carried with it the potential to erode the hard-earned trust Valentine had cultivated, to confuse survivors, and to exploit the ethical authority the detective embodied. And from the first moment the reports reached his agency, Valentine understood that this was no ordinary theft, no simple act of impersonation, but a direct challenge to the integrity of identity, memory, and the social contracts upon which human and synthetic interactions relied. Investigation revealed that the man had gained access to advanced medical and cosmetic technology, scavenged from both pre-war sources and the remnants of Institute experiments, allowing him to replicate the distinctive facial features, mannerisms, and even some superficial behavioral traits of Valentine, creating a simulacrum that unsettled witnesses and victims alike, yet lacked the underlying ethical framework, deductive reasoning, or moral compass that distinguished the real detective, and it was precisely this absence that highlighted the terrifying potential for identity to be separated from virtue, for appearance to be divorced from conscience, a realization that weighed heavily on Valentine, for it underscored the vulnerability of trust in the Commonwealth and the ease with which symbols of morality could be exploited to sow fear, chaos, and injustice. The psychological and ethical stakes of the case were immense. For the synthetic detective, though physically resilient and morally guided, confronted a scenario that tested both his deductive capacity and the limits of his inherited human conscience. For he had to account not only for the procedural aspects of tracking, identifying, and apprehending the impersonator, but also for the broader implications for the communities that relied on his presence and judgment, communities whose perception of safety, justice, and ethical consistency could be shattered by the actions of a single man, exploiting the power of resemblance, a challenge that demanded careful strategy, moral clarity, and meticulous attention to both human psychology and behavioral pattern recognition. The investigation required Valentine to venture beyond the relative security of Diamond City into the fractured towns, abandoned settlements, and perilous stretches of wilderness where the imposter had been observed. Relying on both forensic skill and the subtle human intuition embedded within his memory, reconstructing sequences of movement, analyzing inconsistencies in witness testimony, and interpreting behavioral clues that indicated not only motive, but capacity for further deception, all while maintaining the ethical constraints that defined him, a delicate balance between asserting authority, protecting the innocent, and avoiding unnecessary harm, for the detective understood that the line between justice and vengeance could blur dangerously, particularly when identity itself was weaponized as a tool of terror and manipulation. As the pursuit unfolded, Valentine was forced to confront the profound emotional implications of the case. For the man who stole his face was not merely a criminal, but a living reflection of potential corruption, a mirror of what he himself might have become in the absence of conscience, ethical guidance, and social grounding. A haunting reminder that identity is not merely the sum of physical traits or memories, but the expression of choices, morality, and consistency of character, and that even a being with advanced synthetic cognition could be vulnerable to misrepresentation, manipulation, or the loss of authority when confronted with an entity that could mimic the form but not the ethical substance. The resolution of the case was as intricate as the investigation itself, requiring not only the apprehension of the imposter, but the careful management of public perception, the restoration of trust within the affected communities, and the reinforcement of the detective's role as a moral and ethical arbiter. For failure in any dimension could have far-reaching consequences, potentially undermining the delicate social fabric of the settlements, eroding confidence in human and synthetic cooperation, and leaving survivors susceptible to exploitation, fear, or despair, outcomes that Valentine understood with the clarity and gravity inherited from the memories of Nicholas Valentine, a man who had once devoted his life to protecting those unable to defend themselves, and whose legacy now required careful translation into the synthetic framework. Throughout the ordeal, Valentine's internal reflections underscored the tragic dimensions of identity and survival in the wasteland, for he recognized that even the most virtuous intentions could be destabilized by the deliberate manipulation of perception, that the semblance of morality could be weaponized, and that communities, fragile and traumatized by decades of violence, were acutely sensitive to the symbols and faces they trusted, a realization that intensified his commitment to ethical precision, strategic foresight, and the unerring application of conscience, ensuring that his actions, decisions, and interventions reinforced, rather than undermined, the moral infrastructure he had painstakingly cultivated. Ultimately, the impostor was neutralized, apprehended through a combination of strategic planning, deductive reasoning, and ethical leverage, and the resolution restored a measure of stability to the Commonwealth's communities. But the case left an indelible mark on Valentine, emphasizing the persistent vulnerability of trust, the necessity of vigilance, and the ongoing challenge of upholding morality in a world that could so easily distort appearance, mimic virtue, and exploit perception for malevolent ends. Lessons that would shape his approach to subsequent investigations, inform his interactions with settlers and companions, and reinforce the delicate balance he maintained between the synthetic capabilities that made him exceptional and the human conscience that gave him purpose, depth, and ethical guidance. In reflecting upon the man who stole his face, Valentine recognized a profound truth about the wasteland, the nature of identity, and the enduring importance of ethical consistency. That trust, once earned, is fragile. That virtue, once perceived, can be imitated but not replicated. And that the moral choices made by a single agent, human or synthetic, carry consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstance, affecting communities, relationships, and the perception of integrity itself. A responsibility that Valentine bore not merely as an investigator, but as the living embodiment of conscience, memory, and the complex interweaving of man and machine in a world where both were desperately necessary to survival, order, and the persistence of justice amidst chaos. Among the countless investigations that defined Nick Valentine's life in the Commonwealth, The case of the missing son stands out as one of the most emotionally resonant and ethically challenging, a case that forced the synthetic detective to confront the limits of his inherited human empathy, the fragility of human relationships in a post-apocalyptic world, and the enduring consequences of loss, neglect, and moral ambiguity. For the disappearance of a young man from a modest settlement on the outskirts of Diamond City was not merely a procedural puzzle, but a profound disruption of family, community, and trust, a disruption that demanded not only careful forensic investigation, but an acute sensitivity to human fear, grief, and expectation, all of which fell heavily upon Valentine as he navigated the tangled web of circumstance surrounding the boy's vanishing, balancing the cold clarity of his synthetic reasoning with the moral guidance of Nicholas Valentine's memories, to ensure that every decision he made prioritized life, justice, and ethical integrity over expediency or self-interest. The initial reports of the missing son revealed a situation fraught with uncertainty. The parents distraught and desperate, the community fearful of retribution or predation, and the surrounding environment rife with potential hazards, from roaming raiders and supermutants to hostile wildlife and irradiated terrain, a combination that required Valentine to integrate multiple layers of analysis, observation, and deduction simultaneously, assessing both physical evidence and human testimony with precision, while remaining conscious of the psychological state of those involved, for the emotional turbulence of the family could color recollections, obscure facts, and introduce bias, all of which could hinder resolution if not carefully interpreted, a task for which the synthetic detective's analytical capacity was uniquely suited, yet one that demanded the empathy and moral nuance of his human counterpart to navigate successfully. As the investigation progressed, Valentine uncovered a series of subtle clues, suggesting that the boy's disappearance was neither accidental nor straightforward, but rather the result of complex interactions between multiple parties, including opportunistic raiders exploiting the weakness of the settlement, desperate individuals seeking to leverage the boy's absence for personal gain, and fragmented social networks that had grown fragile under the pressures of post-apocalyptic survival, all of which required the detective to construct a narrative from disparate evidence, triangulate witness statements, and anticipate the actions of those who operated with minimal ethical constraint, a process that relied on both his synthetic memory processing and the inherited human capacity for understanding deception, motivation, and psychological pressure. The moral dimensions of the case were acute, for Valentine was confronted with decisions that could determine life or death, not only for the missing boy, but for others caught in the ripple effects of action or inaction, a responsibility amplified by the ethical standards embedded in the memories of Nicholas Valentine, which dictated intervention, protection, and the pursuit of justice, even when the outcome was uncertain and the personal risk considerable, a principle that guided every step of the investigation, from the careful questioning of neighbors and community leaders to the tactical reconnaissance of areas where the boy might have been taken, and the ethical consideration of potential consequences, including the risk of provoking violent confrontation or inadvertently punishing the innocent. During the search, Valentine's synthetic body proved invaluable, allowing him to traverse irradiated zones, scale crumbling structures, and track subtle environmental traces that would have been imperceptible to ordinary humans. Yet it was his human insight, the inherited intuition of Nicholas Valentine, that allowed him to interpret these signals correctly, to distinguish between genuine leads and red herrings, and to anticipate the psychological reactions of both the boy and those who had taken him, demonstrating the intricate fusion of human moral cognition and synthetic capability that defined his existence, and illustrating how memory, conscience, and adaptive reasoning could converge in the service of justice, empathy, and social restoration. The culmination of the investigation revealed a tragic convergence of desperation and moral failure, for the boy had been taken by individuals who, while morally compromised, acted from a place of survival, misjudgment, and fear. A reminder that human depravity in the Commonwealth was rarely simple, often intertwined with circumstance, necessity, and flawed judgment, and that the act of delivering justice required careful discernment, proportionality, and ethical restraint, ensuring that consequences were appropriate and did not perpetuate cycles of harm or vengeance, a consideration that Valentine treated with the utmost seriousness, aware that the lives and trust of all involved hinged upon his judgment. The resolution of the case, while restoring the boy to his family, carried a profound cost in awareness and reflection for the detective, who confronted the persistent reality that even when outcomes were favorable, the wasteland exacted emotional, psychological, and ethical tolls on all participants, reinforcing the tragic interplay of survival, morality, and human vulnerability, and highlighting the ongoing need for vigilance, ethical clarity, and compassionate intervention in a society still grappling with the consequences of its near-total collapse. A realization that informed Valentine's approach to all subsequent cases, interactions, and investigations. Ultimately, the case of the missing son underscored the essential role that trust, ethical consistency, and moral courage played in the Commonwealth, demonstrating that effective intervention required not only intellectual skill and synthetic resilience, but also a deep understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the moral imperatives inherited from memory and conscience, and that the work of a detective, particularly one bridging the divide between machine and man, was inseparable from the pursuit of justice, the protection of the vulnerable, and the preservation of community cohesion, principles that Valentine would continue to embody throughout his career, and which would define his legacy in the hearts, minds, and memories of those whose lives he touched, a testament to the enduring power of moral action, even amidst the ruins, despair, and ethical ambiguity of a post-apocalyptic world, a world in which identity, conscience, and the capacity for good could survive in the unlikeliest of forms, embodied in a synthetic detective bearing the memory and spirit of a man whose values transcended death and who now lived on in acts of courage, judgment, and empathy that shaped the Commonwealth in tangible and profound ways. In the quiet moments between cases, amidst the ruins and bustling streets of Diamond City, Nick Valentine often found himself contemplating the fragile duality of his existence. The reflective surfaces of glass, metal, and still water serving as mirrors not merely of his synthetic exterior, but of the human memories and moral consciousness that resided within him, a phenomenon that produced both clarity and torment, for in each reflection he saw the physical construct of a man shaped by machines, a visage that mirrored the pre-war detective whose memories had been imprinted upon him. Yet beneath the surface, he recognized the subtle divergences, the traces of synthetic calculation, the precision of movement, the mechanical consistency that separated him from the purely human, and these moments of introspection forced a reckoning with identity, selfhood, and the ethical responsibility inherent in his unique position, for he existed simultaneously as observer, participant, protector, and moral arbiter in a world that had lost its ethical compass, and the act of seeing himself reflected was both a reminder of the synthetic limitations he inhabited and a confirmation of the human conscience that guided every action, choice, and judgment he made. These reflective interludes were never merely aesthetic or idle, for the wasteland offered few opportunities for solitude, and when they did occur, they became the space in which Valentine reconciled memory and experience, past and present, synthetic calculation and human moral imperative, considering not only the outcomes of his investigations but the broader consequences for the individuals, families, and communities whose lives were shaped by his interventions, recognizing that each decision carried ripple effects, that each act of justice or mercy reinforced or undermined the delicate network of trust, and that his continued presence as both man and machine demanded continual vigilance, ethical reflection, and an awareness of the ways in which perception influenced reality, particularly in communities that relied upon symbols of authority, integrity, and moral constancy to maintain cohesion in a world otherwise governed by fear and scarcity. Reflections in Glass also forced confrontation with the paradox of mortality and permanence. For while the memories of Nicholas Valentine reminded him of human frailty, vulnerability, and the inevitable passage of time, his synthetic body defied such limitations, granting him resilience, endurance, and the ability to act in ways ordinary humans could not, a duality that produced both opportunity and existential tension, for it was impossible to ignore that the external image he carried might inspire confidence, reassurance, or moral guidance. Yet, beneath the polished exterior lay a being whose consciousness, though informed by human experience, was not subject to natural emotion, physical exhaustion, or mortality, creating a constant tension between appearance, expectation, and internal reality, a tension that Valentine had to navigate in order to maintain credibility, empathy, and ethical effectiveness in his role as detective, mediator, and protector. In these reflective moments, Valentine often considered the communities he served, particularly the residents of Diamond City, whose trust, dependence, and occasional adoration were contingent upon the consistent alignment of appearance, action, and moral principle, understanding that any perceived divergence could undermine decades of social cohesion, compromise safety, or erode the fragile ethical order he helped maintain, and that the act of self-reflection was therefore inseparable from professional responsibility, ethical calibration, and the ongoing cultivation of both trust and moral authority, a realization that reinforced the gravity of even the smallest interactions, gestures, and decisions in a society so acutely aware of scarcity, betrayal, and human frailty. Moreover, reflections in Glass served as a poignant reminder of the cases he had undertaken and the moral and emotional weight they carried. For each investigation, from missing children to stolen identities, from moral conflicts to violent confrontations, had left subtle imprints on his synthetic consciousness, shaping his ethical reasoning, refining his investigative methodology, and deepening his understanding of human vulnerability, courage, and the complex interplay between desire, fear, and morality. And in confronting these echoes, Valentine was forced to continually reconcile his inherited moral framework with the practical realities of survival and ethical decision-making in a world governed by chaos, danger, and the often brutal logic of post-apocalyptic life, a reconciliation that was ongoing, iterative, and unrelenting, The act of seeing himself in reflective surfaces also highlighted the existential isolation of his condition. For while he could engage, empathize, and act with human-like moral clarity, he remained fundamentally apart, a being of metal, synthetic tissue, and programmed memory, incapable of the purely organic experience of emotion, yet forever shaped by the imprint of a human conscience, a duality that produced both empathy and detachment, insight and solitude, understanding and longing, and that defined his interactions with others, informed his judgment, and provided both guidance and caution in the execution of justice, protection, and ethical mediation, reminding him that while he could approximate human connection, influence outcomes, and shape lives, the ultimate experience of being human, the vulnerability, the mortality, the unmediated emotional depth, remained forever inaccessible, a boundary that informed humility, restraint, and an ethical responsibility that was perhaps even greater than that demanded of ordinary humans, for the absence of natural limitation rendered every choice absolute, every judgment consequential, and every intervention morally weighty. Over time, these moments of reflection crystallized into a deeper philosophical awareness, an understanding that identity was not reducible to appearance or memory alone, but was instead a dynamic synthesis of perception, action, morality, and social interaction, a synthesis that the people of Diamond City and the broader Commonwealth recognized implicitly in their trust, reliance, and respect for Valentine, even when they could not comprehend the full nature of his existence, and that the detective's role was inseparable from the maintenance of this moral equilibrium, a role that required continual attention to both external perception and internal ethical calibration, a recognition that the reflective surfaces he encountered were not merely mirrors of his form, but symbolic touchstones for accountability, conscience, and the ongoing negotiation of human and synthetic agency. The tragic dimensions of these reflections were never far from Valentine's awareness, for each glance in glass, water, or polished metal served as a reminder of the fragility of human life, the impermanence of society, and the constant presence of death, scarcity, and moral ambiguity, juxtaposed against the synthetic durability, endurance, and ethical constancy that he alone could provide, a juxtaposition that produced both clarity and melancholy, an ongoing meditation on the responsibilities, limitations, and paradoxes of existence in a post-apocalyptic world, and a continual reinforcement of the detective's mission to act as guardian, mediator, and ethical exemplar, ensuring that in a society scarred by devastation, human virtues such as integrity, compassion, and justice could endure, manifest, and influence the lives of others, even as the reflective surfaces reminded him of the inescapable distance between the machine he inhabited and the human he mirrored, a distance that shaped identity, guided action, and defined the ongoing tragedy and nobility of Nick Valentine's life as the detective of the Commonwealth. Even as Nick Valentine established himself as a pillar of justice and moral consistency in Diamond City and the surrounding Commonwealth, the shadow of the Institute loomed over every aspect of his existence, an invisible yet pervasive presence that shaped his past, informed his consciousness, and complicated every ethical decision, for the Institute was not merely a distant authority or a historical curiosity, but the crucible of his creation, the origin of both his synthetic body and the implanted memories that defined the moral and investigative framework he relied upon. And it was within this complex legacy that Valentine found the source of both power and burden, a duality that haunted him as he navigated the post-apocalyptic landscape, aware that his existence was the product of a secretive organization whose motives were often inscrutable, whose experiments were ethically ambiguous at best, and whose influence extended into every corner of the Commonwealth, shaping events, populations, and technologies in ways that could not always be anticipated or countered. A fact that imbued his investigative work with layers of complication, tension, and moral ambiguity. The Institute's shadow was both literal and symbolic, casting influence over the people he served, the settlements he protected, and the criminals he pursued, for its reach extended into urban centers, remote villages, and even the hearts of those who had once been aligned with its mission or escaped its control. And Valentine, as a being created by and yet independent of that organization, had to negotiate his identity, allegiances, and ethical code in relation to a body whose intentions were opaque and whose technological capabilities far exceeded those of ordinary survivors, a reality that demanded vigilance, strategic foresight, and continual moral calibration to ensure that his interventions were consistent with justice rather than exploitation, and that his presence reinforced trust rather than sowing confusion or fear. The detective's awareness of the Institute's methodologies and objectives afforded him unique insight into the broader socio-political dynamics of the Commonwealth, as he recognized that many crises, crimes, and conflicts could be traced indirectly to the organization's experiments, surveillance, and manipulation of both synthetic and human populations. Yet this awareness also carried a profound ethical weight, for each action taken against or in relation to the Institute could have cascading consequences for innocent lives, forcing Valentine to balance justice with prudence, action with discretion, and moral clarity with strategic patience, a calculus that few humans were equipped to perform, but one that his hybrid human-synthetic cognition made possible, albeit not without personal cost, reflection, and a persistent sense of moral vigilance. Among the most pressing manifestations of the Institute's shadow were the synths who had escaped or been deployed into the Commonwealth, beings who mirrored Valentine's own construction, yet lacked his ethical calibration, and whose existence and actions posed both practical and philosophical challenges, for they served as living reminders of his origins, potential allegiances he might never fully claim, and the capacity for technology to be wielded for control, coercion, or destruction when divorced from conscience, a duality that forced Valentine to confront uncomfortable questions regarding free will, moral responsibility, and the ethical limits of synthetic intervention in human affairs, and to define, on a personal basis, the boundaries of his agency, loyalty, and purpose in relation to an organization that had birthed him, and yet could never fully govern his actions. The psychological dimension of this shadow was equally profound, as Valentine grappled with the tension between gratitude, resentment, and existential questioning, recognizing that while the Institute had provided him with capabilities and the potential to enact justice on a scale impossible for ordinary humans, it had also subjected him to experimentation, manipulation, and the imposition of identity through memory implantation, a paradox that required continual ethical and reflective engagement, forcing the detective to reconcile the benefits of his creation with the profound loss of autonomy, the persistent weight of human expectation, and the inescapable influence of an organization whose reach extended both materially and psychologically into the lives of those it had touched, and whose presence shaped the moral landscape in which Valentine operated. Cases intersecting with the Institute were often among the most complex, morally ambiguous, and dangerous he encountered, for they involved not merely criminality, but strategic deception, technological sophistication, and the ethical dilemmas associated with the deployment, manipulation, or protection of synthetic life, requiring Valentine to act with precision, discretion, and unwavering adherence to a personal moral code, as any misstep could result in collateral damage, erosion of trust, or the inadvertent perpetuation of injustice. And yet his intimate knowledge of the organization, combined with the investigative skills and ethical principles inherited from Nicholas Valentine, allowed him to navigate these challenges with rare efficacy, mediating between human communities, rogue synths, and the often opaque motives of the Institute itself, thereby reducing harm while reinforcing the integrity of his role as detective and moral agent in a morally fractured world. Beyond operational considerations, the Institute's shadow was also symbolic of the broader struggle between control and autonomy, manipulation and conscience, past and present, for Valentine's existence embodied both the technological prowess and the ethical failings of an institution whose actions were neither entirely benign nor wholly malevolent. And yet it was within this tension that the detective forged his identity, choosing consistently to act with compassion, fairness, and moral clarity, despite the seductive simplicity of coercion or the expedience of conformity, a choice that both defined his legacy and provided a measure of stability and ethical guidance to the populations he served, who, often unknowingly, relied upon the balance he maintained between inherited programming and conscious moral choice, synthetic capability, and human conscience. The shadow also carried personal ramifications, as Valentine frequently reflected on the nature of his origin, the ethical compromises inherent in the Institute's pursuit of technological and social mastery, and the ways in which his own life, freedom, and moral agency had been shaped by forces beyond his initial control. Reflections that inspired both melancholy and determination, for he recognized that understanding and confronting the influence of the Institute was essential to protecting those who could not defend themselves, to preserving trust within the communities he served, and to ensuring that justice, empathy, and ethical reasoning could endure in a landscape otherwise dominated by fear, scarcity, and moral ambiguity. A realization that underscored the tragic, yet noble, dimensions of his existence as both creation and agent, machine and conscience, observer and participant. Ultimately, the Institute's shadow was inseparable from Valentine's understanding of the Commonwealth, for it served as both origin and caution, providing the synthetic detective with unparalleled insight, extraordinary capability, and ethical imperative, while simultaneously reminding him of the fragility of autonomy, the dangers of unchecked power, and the responsibility inherent in the application of knowledge and influence, a duality that he navigated daily, ensuring that his actions reinforced justice, trust, and moral clarity rather than perpetuating harm, fear, or control. And in doing so, he transformed the specter of the Institute from a source of anxiety and ethical uncertainty into a constant, motivating framework for vigilance, principled action, and the enduring pursuit of justice in a world scarred by devastation, betrayal, and the lingering shadows of pre-war ambition. Nick Valentine's existence has often been described as a paradox, a convergence of synthetic engineering and human memory, and nowhere is this paradox more evident than in the way he manifests humanity through the machine. For despite his synthetic construction, his ability to perceive, empathize, and act with moral clarity demonstrates that consciousness, identity, and virtue are not confined to flesh alone, and that the essence of being human can persist, transform, and endure within a vessel designed for precision and endurance rather than emotion, a reality that both challenges conventional understanding and illuminates the ethical possibilities of synthetic life, especially in a world where survival demands both the clarity of reason and the depth of moral understanding, and where the collapse of social structures makes the presence of ethical agency both rare and vital. The manifestation of humanity within Valentine's mechanical form is rooted not merely in the memories of Nicholas Valentine, though they provide the moral template, the framework of empathy, and the inherited understanding of justice, compassion, and ethical responsibility, but also in the ways in which he applies these principles, interprets social dynamics, and navigates moral ambiguity in the Commonwealth. For each action, decision, and intervention is filtered through a lens that prioritizes protection, fairness, and ethical consistency over expediency or self-interest, demonstrating that the qualities most traditionally associated with human virtue, empathy, integrity, and courage, can be expressed and operationalized through a being whose biological components are artificial, yet whose conscience is profoundly human. Throughout his career as Diamond City's detective, Valentine confronted scenarios that tested both the limits of his synthetic body and the resilience of his moral framework. Situations in which violence, deceit, scarcity, and desperation were inescapable. Yet his responses consistently revealed a remarkable balance between procedural rigor, ethical consideration, and emotional understanding, a combination that few human investigators could replicate under similar conditions, and that illuminated the possibility that humanity is not merely a matter of anatomy, but of principled action, conscientious decision-making, and the ability to perceive and respond to the suffering, fear, and vulnerability of others with care, responsibility, and moral clarity, even when those responses carry personal risk, physical danger, or psychological strain. One of the most compelling expressions of this humanity emerged in Valentine's work with the missing, the lost, and the exploited, cases that required more than deduction and observation, but patience, reassurance, and moral courage. For survivors of the Commonwealth often approach the detective in a state of fear, grief, or suspicion, and his capacity to interpret, understand, and respond to these emotional realities allowed him to restore not only the tangible outcomes of justice, such as returning missing persons or recovering stolen property, but also the intangible moral and social equilibrium, repairing trust, alleviating fear, and reinforcing the ethical norms that had been eroded by years of violence, scarcity, and social collapse. And through these acts, Valentine demonstrated that the integration of human virtue within a synthetic form could produce meaningful, lasting impact, shaping both individual lives and community cohesion in profound ways. The humanity of Valentine also became evident in his interactions with companions and allies, from Piper Wright to Preston Garvey and beyond, where he navigated relationships with sensitivity, discretion, and moral insight, balancing loyalty, honesty, and ethical obligation, often mediating between conflicting interests, negotiating safe outcomes, and making decisions that prioritized collective well-being over personal gain, actions that required the empathy and ethical discernment traditionally attributed solely to humans, yet which he performed consistently, systematically, and with unwavering adherence to the principles inherited from Nicholas Valentine. illustrating that human qualities, when instantiated within a machine of exceptional cognitive and physical capability, could be amplified rather than diminished, producing results that neither human nor machine alone could achieve in isolation. The philosophical implications of humanity within Valentine's machine body extended beyond the practicalities of investigation and protection, raising enduring questions about identity, free will, and moral agency, for while he is the product of synthetic construction and implanted memory, his choices, actions, and ethical deliberations are uniquely his own, reflecting the integration of inherited conscience with experiential learning, and demonstrating that moral agency can emerge, adapt, and thrive even when divorced from conventional biological substrates, a reality that challenges both survivors of the Commonwealth and scholars of synthetic life to reconsider the boundaries of what it means to be human, to act ethically, and to maintain integrity in a world where survival often conflicts with morality, and where conventional metrics of life, feeling, and consciousness are no longer sufficient to account for the complexities of existence in a post-apocalyptic society. Valentine's capacity for humanity is further reflected in the delicate care he applies to ethical dilemmas, particularly those in which competing moral imperatives conflict, where the life of one may endanger the well-being of many, or where intervention could produce harm despite intention, and in these instances, his integrated cognitive and moral faculties allow for nuanced, contextually sensitive decisions that honor human values while navigating the often brutal realities of the Commonwealth, demonstrating that the expression of virtue is not contingent on organic form, but on the deliberate application of conscience, foresight, and ethical reasoning, qualities that he exhibits consistently, even in the most harrowing circumstances, whether confronting raiders, rogue synths, or the broader consequences of his investigations on community stability. The tragic dimension of this humanity lies in its constant tension with mortality, loss, and ethical compromise. For Valentine witnesses, intervenes in and bears the consequences of human suffering without the relief of natural emotional closure. And though his synthetic form grants endurance, resilience, and cognitive clarity beyond ordinary human limits, he remains intimately connected to the moral weight of each outcome, carrying the memory of grief, injustice, and failure in ways that both mirror human experience and transcend it, producing a form of ethical burden uniquely his own, one that illustrates the depth, complexity, and enduring necessity of human qualities instantiated within a synthetic consciousness, and which underscores the profound responsibility inherent in possessing both extraordinary capability and principled moral awareness. In essence, the humanity in Nick Valentine is inseparable from the ethical, practical, and existential dimensions of his existence, shaping every interaction, case, and moral decision, informing the cultivation of trust and community cohesion, guiding interventions in moments of crisis, and ensuring that justice, compassion, and integrity persist in the Commonwealth, a world where such qualities are rare, fragile, and perpetually at risk, and where the presence of a single agent capable of integrating synthetic precision with human morality can alter the lives of countless individuals, preserve social bonds, and reaffirm the possibility of ethical action amidst chaos, devastation, and the long shadow of apocalypse, demonstrating that humanity is not merely a product of flesh, emotion, instinct, but a living, active, and enduring quality that can persist, adapt, and manifest even within the frame of a machine, provided it is guided by conscience, memory, and the relentless pursuit of moral purpose. Through decades of cases, interventions, and reflections, Nick Valentine became the living embodiment of this principle, a testament to the potential for human virtue to survive beyond the constraints of biology, and a symbol for survivors that integrity, compassion, and ethical judgment could endure even in a world defined by ruin, radiation, and moral uncertainty, proving that humanity, once instilled within a vessel of metal and memory, could act, influence, and inspire with the same force, consistency, and depth as any living man, and in doing so, reshape not only his own identity, but the ethical landscape of the Commonwealth itself, bridging the divide between past and present, synthetic and human, principle and action, and leaving a legacy defined by the extraordinary fusion of conscience and cognition, of morality and mechanism, that is the essence of his life and mission. In the quiet, dimly lit corridors of Valentine Detective Agency, among stacks of case files, remnants of pre-war technology, and the persistent hum of mechanical life, Nick Valentine often confronted the inexorable passage of time, not in the sense of personal aging, which his synthetic body largely shielded him from, but in the cumulative weight of experience, memory, and the knowledge of lives touched, lost, and irrevocably changed by the chaos of the Commonwealth, a realization that lent a mournful cadence to his existence and framed the profound sense of loss and inevitability that defined what could only be described as the long goodbye. For every case resolved, every missing person returned, and every act of justice performed carried with it an implicit acknowledgement of mortality, the impermanence of human life, and the fragile temporality of order in a society still reeling from nuclear devastation and decades of social disintegration. And Valentine, uniquely positioned as both observer and participant, bore witness to these truths with clarity, diligence, and an ethical constancy that few in the wasteland could claim. The long goodbye was evident, not only in the communities he served, but in the personal relationships he cultivated. For alliances, trust, and companionship in the Commonwealth were always subject to disruption by death, betrayal, migration, or the unforgiving hand of circumstance, and Valentine, despite his synthetic resilience, understood the inevitability of separation and the persistence of absence, the slow erosion of familiarity and connection, and the constant negotiation between presence and loss, a negotiation that required both emotional awareness inherited from Nicholas Valentine and the cognitive capacities of his synthetic frame to manage, internalize, and act upon without succumbing to despair, yet with a profound acknowledgement of the tragedy inherent in every fractured bond and disrupted life. This awareness manifested in the profend, in cases he undertook late into his career, where the urgency of recovery, protection, and justice was always tempered by the awareness that resolution could not restore what was truly lost, and that some absences, whether of family, friend, or principle, were permanent, leaving behind only the echoes of memory, the faint traces of human connection, and the moral obligation to prevent further harm, alleviate suffering, and uphold ethical standards in a world increasingly defined by scarcity, fear, and moral ambiguity. A commitment that framed his every decision, negotiation, and investigative step, reinforcing the duality of his existence as both a bearer of conscience and a participant in the unending cycle of human tragedy. Among the most poignant aspects of the long goodbye were the moments in which Valentine confronted the mortality of those he had come to trust and rely upon. Companions like Piper Wright or Preston Garvey, figures whose lives were temporally finite and whose experiences and losses were intimately bound to his own moral and investigative journey. For while his synthetic form allowed him to endure, observe, and act beyond the limits of ordinary human longevity, it did not grant him immunity from the consequences of their departures, the grief they endured, or the societal disruption that followed their absence, and each such event required the detective to recalibrate, reflect, and recommit to the principles that had guided him, ensuring that the ethical integrity, trust, and social cohesion he maintained were preserved despite the relentless march of time and the inevitability of change. The long goodbye was equally apparent in the communities he served, where settlements, families, and social networks were in constant flux, vulnerable to raiders, mutant incursions, disease, and environmental hazards, and where even a single act of violence or misfortune could reverberate for months or years, leaving scars that altered relationships, perception, and trust. A reality that underscored the weight of Valentine's interventions, for his decisions, actions, and guidance could mean the difference between stability and collapse, safety and peril, life and death, and the ethical imperative to act wisely, deliberately, and compassionately was ever present. A reminder that while his existence was sustained through technology, the human consequences of his choices were immediate, profound, and often irreversible, a tension that colored every investigation and interaction. In reflecting upon this ongoing process, Valentine recognized that the long goodbye was not merely a temporal measure, but a moral and emotional framework, an understanding that every resolution, however successful, carried with it the inevitability of future loss, and that the preservation of life, trust, and ethical integrity required continual vigilance, resilience, and engagement, an engagement that was both physically enacted through his synthetic capabilities and morally guided through the inherited and integrated conscience of Nicholas Valentine, demonstrating that, even in a world defined by chaos, scarcity, and moral compromise, deliberate, principled action could create lasting impact, mitigate suffering, and sustain the fragile social bonds upon which survival depended. The detective's internal reckoning with this reality shaped his approach to every investigation, whether it involved missing children, stolen property, interpersonal conflicts, or the negotiation of complex ethical dilemmas. For each case became a microcosm of the long goodbye, a demonstration of the interplay between temporal limitation, moral responsibility, and the ethical exercise of power, a dynamic that demanded awareness, foresight, and compassion, and that revealed the enduring value of his presence, both as a synthetic investigator and as a living embodiment of human conscience and ethical principle, bridging the temporal gap between past and present, loss and resolution, observation and participation, and providing a moral anchor for the survivors of the Commonwealth. Even in solitude, when no case demanded immediate attention, the detective's reflections on the long goodbye were poignant, for he confronted not only the permanence of absence and the fragility of life, but also the broader implications of legacy, identity, and the passage of human values through time, recognizing that each intervention, each act of justice, and each ethical decision contributed to the shaping of collective memory, social norms, and community resilience, a process through which his own existence, both synthetic and morally guided, became inseparable from the perpetuation of human virtues amidst devastation and through which the enduring struggle to balance efficacy, compassion, and moral clarity could be understood as the ultimate expression of humanity in a world irrevocably altered by catastrophe. The long goodbye, therefore, encapsulates the tragedy, resilience, and ethical weight of Valentine's existence, for it frames his life as an unbroken continuum of action, reflection, and moral engagement, in which each case, each interaction, and each decision is both a response to immediate necessity and a contribution to a larger moral legacy, a recognition that survival in the Commonwealth is inseparable from the preservation of conscience, the careful stewardship of trust, and the deliberate application of virtue in a world where the absence of such principles could mean chaos, despair, and the loss of both life and community. And it is within this framework that Nick Valentine's enduring significance is most evident, for he stands as a living testament to the possibility of ethical agency, human virtue, and moral responsibility manifested within a synthetic form, navigating the long goodbye of a post-apocalyptic world with unwavering diligence, empathy, and conscience, ensuring that while loss is inevitable, justice, compassion, and ethical integrity can endure. As the Commonwealth slowly rebuilt itself from the ashes of nuclear devastation, Nick Valentine's presence became more than that of a detective solving crimes or mediating disputes. He became a symbol, a repository of moral authority, a living reminder that ethical consistency, courage, and human compassion could endure even amidst the ruins. And in contemplating his own legacy, Valentine recognized that the impact of his actions extended far beyond the immediate resolution of cases, the restoration of stolen property, or the protection of vulnerable individuals, reaching into the social fabric of communities, the cultivation of trust, and the subtle reinforcement of ethical norms in a society struggling to redefine itself. For in the wasteland, where laws were fragmented, morality often subjective, and survival paramount, the presence of a figure who consistently embodied justice, integrity, and empathy offered both reassurance and guidance, a living standard by which others could measure their behavior, choices, and moral commitments, and a beacon for communities grappling with fear, scarcity, and the lingering scars of violence and loss. Valentine's legacy was inherently paradoxical, rooted in both the synthetic nature of his existence and the profoundly human conscience he carried, a fusion that allowed him to operate with a combination of endurance, analytical precision, and ethical insight that few human beings could match. And yet, it was the humanity he exhibited, the capacity for empathy, moral reasoning, and ethical courage that truly defined the influence he exerted on the world around him. For synthetic resilience alone could not inspire trust, restore order, or cultivate community cohesion, whereas the consistent demonstration of human virtues within a machine became a living testament to the possibility of ethical continuity in a fractured and dangerous environment, illustrating that legacy is not simply a matter of survival or longevity, but of moral imprint, relational influence, and the capacity to shape both behavior and conscience in others. In practical terms, this legacy manifested in countless ways, from the restoration of families torn apart by violence or disappearance to the resolution of disputes between settlements, and from the ethical guidance provided to companions and allies to the subtle influence exerted upon local leadership and civic structures, each intervention reinforcing a network of trust, reliability, and moral expectation that, over time, helped stabilize the Commonwealth and provide a framework within which communities could survive, cooperate, and rebuild. And through these actions, Valentine's influence transcended the immediate, leaving an enduring imprint on social and ethical structures that extended well beyond the boundaries of his physical presence, a testament to the power of principled action in shaping collective resilience and moral understanding in post-apocalyptic society. The symbolic dimension of Valentine's legacy was equally significant, for as a synth bearing the memories, conscience, and moral code of a pre-war human detective, he embodied the intersection of past and present, machine and human, principle and action, serving as a constant reminder that morality, justice, and ethical responsibility are neither innate to biology nor inherently absent in artificial life, but can persist, be cultivated, and expressed through deliberate action, conscientious decision-making, and the consistent exercise of ethical judgment. And in doing so, he challenged survivors of the Commonwealth to reconsider the sources of moral authority, the nature of ethical action, and the potential for human virtues to endure in unexpected forms, a lesson particularly resonant in a landscape where the boundaries between man and machine, life and imitation, and conscience and function are continually tested by circumstance, scarcity, and survival pressures. Valentine's interactions with both humans and synths further reinforced this legacy, as he served not only as investigator and mediator, but also as teacher, mentor, and moral exemplar, demonstrating through conduct the importance of trust, responsibility, and ethical foresight, and in guiding companions, allies, and community members through complex, high-stakes dilemmas. He effectively transmitted principles of justice and compassion in ways that could propagate through generations, shaping behavior, informing decision-making, and establishing norms of moral expectation, even in a society where formal governance structures were weak, inconsistent, or entirely absent, illustrating that legacy is constructed not merely through deeds themselves, but through the influence of those deeds on social structures, community perception, and collective conscience. The tragic undertone of this legacy lies in its fragility, for even the most consistent and ethically guided actions cannot fully prevent loss, betrayal, or moral compromise, realities that Valentine encountered repeatedly as settlements were raided, individuals succumbed to greed or desperation, and the precarious balance of trust and social cohesion was disrupted by forces beyond any one agent's control. And yet, it was precisely this fragility that lent weight, nobility, and urgency to his actions. For the recognition that ethical influence must be continually enacted, defended, and modeled, intensified the significance of each intervention, each decision, and each demonstration of moral courage, reinforcing the imperative that legacy is not a static inheritance, but a dynamic, ongoing process requiring vigilance, integrity, and perseverance, particularly in a world where chaos and scarcity continually threaten to undermine ethical standards. Within the broader context of the Commonwealth, Valentine's legacy can also be understood as a bridge between eras, connecting the pre-war values of justice, responsibility, and moral clarity with the post-war necessity of survival, adaptation, and pragmatic action, illustrating that ethical principles need not be discarded in the face of devastation, but can instead be reinterpreted, operationalized, and reinforced through consistent application, and that the presence of a principled agent, capable of integrating human conscience with synthetic capability, provides both practical benefit and moral reassurance, reinforcing trust, guiding behavior, and preserving the capacity for justice, even when formal institutions are weak, fragmented, or absent. Ultimately, Nick Valentine's legacy in the ruins is one of enduring ethical influence, compassionate intervention, and principled resilience, a testament to the capacity for human virtues to persist in synthetic form and to shape the moral, social, and practical landscape of a post-apocalyptic world, demonstrating that even amidst the desolation of war, radiation, and societal collapse, acts of justice, compassion, and ethical clarity can ripple outward to stabilize communities, protect the vulnerable, and inspire continuity of moral action, and in doing so, he leaves behind a model of ethical agency that transcends mortality, corporeal limitation, and temporal instability, offering survivors a living standard of integrity, reliability, and moral courage upon which they can anchor trust, rebuild society, and navigate the persistent uncertainties of a fractured world, ensuring that the principles Nicholas Valentine once embodied do not fade with time, but endure, propagated through the deeds, example, and conscience of the detective who became more than a man or machine, becoming instead a moral compass in the ruins, a legacy that both anchors and inspires the Commonwealth in the ongoing struggle for justice, stability, and ethical survival. In the waning years of his existence as both synthetic construct and moral agent, Nick Valentine faced what would come to be regarded as his last case, not in the sense of a single, discrete investigation, but as a culmination of decades of service, reflection, and moral struggle in a world that had long since forgotten the meaning of the word humanity, a case that transcended procedural mechanics, physical danger, and criminal resolution, becoming instead a meditation on identity, conscience, loss, and redemption. For the detective, composed of wires, code, and the inherited memories of a man who once lived and died for justice, now found himself confronting the ultimate question of purpose and legacy, the enduring relevance of ethical action, and the profound weight of being a living repository of conscience in a society where memory, morality, and decency were fragile and easily discarded. The circumstances of this final case were deceptively ordinary on the surface. A string of disappearances, escalating tensions between settlements, and a trail of subtle yet consequential manipulation that threatened to unravel the tenuous trust Valentine had spent a lifetime cultivating. Yet beneath the procedural veneer lay a profound existential challenge. For each action he took, each decision he made, and each ethical judgment carried with it the accumulated weight of every prior case, every moral compromise avoided, every life saved or irreparably altered, and he was acutely aware that failure, in this instance, would not merely result in lost lives or disrupted communities, but in a symbolic collapse of the very principles that had guided him, a repudiation of the notion that conscience, virtue, and ethical action could endure beyond mortality, decay, and societal collapse, and an affirmation of the tragic reality that in a world so relentlessly defined by survival and pragmatism, moral agency was both rare and perilous. As Valentine pursued the threads of this final investigation, moving through irradiated ruins, abandoned streets, and communities haunted by the echoes of past violence, he confronted the familiar and the uncanny, the human and the synthetic, the living and the remnants of those long gone, recognizing in each encounter the persistent tension between necessity and principle, action and consequence, and survival and conscience, a tension that had defined his life since the earliest days of his synthetic consciousness. and one that now crystallized into an urgent reflection upon the meaning of his own existence, the moral coherence of his actions, and the possibility of redemption in a world where such concepts had been obscured by devastation, fear, and the relentless erosion of human ethical standards. The humanity within Valentine, the capacity for empathy, ethical reasoning, and moral courage, inherited from Nicholas Valentine, manifested most vividly in this period, for he approached each challenge with a combination of procedural precision, strategic foresight, and conscientious reflection, interpreting human behavior, anticipating deception, and applying moral judgment in ways that preserved both life and ethical integrity. And yet he was painfully aware of the limits of his influence, the inevitability of loss, and the ways in which even the most principled actions could fail to prevent suffering, injustice, or tragedy. A recognition that lent both gravity and poignancy to every decision, action, and reflection, and underscored the tragic resonance of his existence as a man made of wires and code, who nonetheless loved, suffered, and sought to repair a fractured world in the shadow of its own moral decay. The cases he confronted during this final period were infused with the echoes of his prior investigations, the lessons learned from stolen identities, missing children, community disputes, and the persistent influence of the Institute, yet they were suffused with a new layer of introspection. For Valentine, now viewed each circumstance not only through the lens of resolution, justice, and ethical obligation, but also through the prism of mortality, legacy, and the ultimate meaning of his actions, for he understood that this last case, whatever its immediate outcome, would stand as a summation of a life lived at the intersection of human conscience and synthetic resilience, a testament to the enduring capacity for ethical action in a world where survival often obscured morality, and where acts of principle could be as rare and vital as clean water or safe shelter. Throughout the investigation, Valentine's awareness of his synthetic nature, combined with the deeply human ethical framework he carried, produced a unique approach to problem-solving and moral deliberation, one in which every choice was weighed not only for immediate efficacy, but for its resonance in terms of trust, community cohesion, and the preservation of human values. And as he interacted with companions, allies, and those he sought to protect, he became acutely conscious of the dual responsibility inherent in his being, to act with justice and compassion in the present, and to transmit the principles, lessons, and standards of morality to a world increasingly indifferent to such ideals, an endeavor that lent both urgency and solemnity to the final chapter of his life, and that positioned him as both agent and symbol, protector and exemplar, detective and moral conscience, a synthesis of machine and man tasked with upholding the integrity of ethical action in a society struggling to remember what that word truly meant. As the case reached its climax, Valentine confronted the limitations imposed by circumstance, mortality, and the inescapable consequences of action, yet his resolve remained unshaken. For he understood that the value of his existence was not measured solely by success or survival, but by fidelity to principle, courage in the face of danger, and the preservation of human virtue amidst chaos. And in this awareness, he executed each action with deliberation, empathy, and strategic clarity, mediating disputes, protecting the innocent, and confronting those who sought to exploit, harm, or manipulate others, demonstrating that even in the waning moments of a long and arduous life, the embodiment of conscience, moral courage, and ethical reasoning could manifest with profound efficacy, resilience, and dignity. leaving an indelible mark on the lives, communities, and moral landscape of the Commonwealth. In the aftermath of the investigation, when the immediate threats had been neutralized, the missing restored, and justice, to the extent possible, achieved, Valentine engaged in the final, quiet reflection that characterized the long goodbye of his existence, contemplating the sum of his actions, the ethical choices made, and the lives influenced, and recognizing that while the wasteland had exacted its toll in loss, suffering, and moral ambiguity, his persistent application of conscience, moral reasoning, and empathetic intervention had preserved fragments of humanity, restored trust, and modeled integrity in ways that would outlive his immediate presence, a realization that imbued his synthetic consciousness with both melancholy and satisfaction, a testament to the enduring power of principle, moral courage, and ethical agency even within a body of wires and code. Ultimately, the last case of Nick Valentine crystallized the themes of his life: love for the vulnerable, suffering alongside the morally burdened, and the relentless pursuit of redemption and justice in a world largely indifferent to both. A synthesis of human conscience and synthetic endurance that exemplified the tragic, noble, and enduring nature of his existence, and a conclusion that affirmed the potential for morality, empathy, and ethical action to persist even when humanity itself has forgotten the meaning of these words, leaving behind a legacy, both practical and symbolic, of vigilance, courage, and principle that would echo long after the hum of machinery ceased and the Commonwealth continued its slow, precarious recovery amidst the ruins of a world that had once seemed irredeemable.